You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In this chilling first-person account, a former government doctor breaks her silence about a national crisis that, according to her, wasn't what it seemed. What begins as a mysterious outbreak quickly unravels into something far more disturbing, something that challenges our understanding of truth, fear, and control. With society collapsing and lives at stake, she risks everything to share what she discovered behind locked doors, encrypted files, and silent corridors. Inspired by real historical conspiracies, this story dives deep into psychological manipulation, government secrecy, and the haunting cost of knowing too much. Whether you believe her or not, you'll never see the world the same way again. If you love slow-burn horror, government conspiracies, and stories that make you question reality itself, subscribe to Soul Studios now, because the next story we tell might already be whispering in your ears.
My name is Dr. Evelyn Barnes, and if you're watching this, it means I'm either in hiding or already dead. This is the story I never wanted to tell, the one I've run from for far too long. But after everything I've seen, after the lives lost and the lies told, I can't stay silent anymore. I still remember the first day it all felt wrong. It was 2 years ago, a gray morning in early spring. I was at the Central City Medical Center, where I worked as an epidemiologist. News had broken of a mysterious viral outbreak spreading through our city. We'd dealt with outbreaks before, but this one, it was different. Patients were flooding in with high fevers, bleeding gums, strange rashes, symptoms that mimicked several diseases at once. At first, we thought it was some aggressive hemorrhagic fever. It was terrifying, but there was something even more unsettling beneath the surface that I couldn't put my finger on. That morning, I stood in the crowded hospital corridor, an N95 mask suctioned to my face, trying to make sense of the chaos. A panicked young nurse grabbed my arm, her eyes wide above her mask, and she whispered, "Dr. Barnes, none of the tests make sense." We had run every diagnostic test we could, viral panels, bacterial cultures, toxicology screens, and all came back negative or inconclusive. It was as if the illness didn't exist in any database. How could so many people be sick with something we couldn't even identify? My stomach lurched with a new kind of fear. I didn't know it then, but this was my first glimpse into the nightmare of Project Decibel. At noon that day, a government task force arrived at the hospital. They wore hazmat suits and moved with a purpose that made the rest of us look like we were standing still. Usually, the CDC or a federal epidemic team would take charge in an outbreak, but these people, they were different. They carried no logos, no standard identification. One of them thrust a stack of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, into my hands before I could even ask a question. "Standard procedure," he said curtly through his respirator. "Sign and don't discuss anything you see." It struck me as odd. None of us had ever been forced to sign NDAs during an outbreak response. But in the urgency of the moment, with lives on the line, I shoved aside my unease and scribbled my name. We needed all the help we could get. Soon, the ward was crawling with these anonymous officials. They cordoned off the ICU, sequestered the worst patients behind plastic sheeting, and forbade hospital staff from entering without explicit permission. We were effectively locked out of our own patients' care. That evening, I walked past one of those plastic-shrouded ICU rooms. Through a small, clear window, I saw 2 of the hazmat-suited operatives standing over a patient's bed. The patient, a middle-aged man, was thrashing, clearly in delirium. I could hear him even through the thick barriers. He was screaming about voices, about loud sounds that no one else could hear. I'll never forget his words, because at the time they made no sense. "Please, make the ringing stop! It's so loud! It's so loud!" He was crying, clawing at his ears. The operatives injected him with something, and seconds later, he went still. Too still. I remember pressing my hand to the glass, watching in horror as his vital signs flatlined on the monitor. The operatives exchanged some words I couldn't hear, and then one of them looked up and saw me watching. Even behind his face shield, I felt the weight of his glare. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Something was very wrong here. At that moment, a thought flashed in my mind uninvited. This isn't really about a virus, is it? I pushed it away as quickly as it came. Exhausted and terrified, I told myself I was being paranoid. There was a deadly outbreak and people were dying. That was enough to focus on. But that night, I barely slept. I had no idea that this bizarre outbreak was only the opening act of a much darker play. In the days that followed, my initial unease grew into gnawing suspicion. The outbreak spread rapidly. Too rapidly, almost as if the contagion had perfect timing. By the end of the week, every state in the country reported cases. There were mandatory curfews and lockdowns. The public was told this virus had a shocking fatality rate. The phrase proportionate mortality event was thrown around on the news, a clinical way to say an alarming portion of our population was dying. It felt like we were living the script of a doomsday film. But behind the scenes, in the hospital halls and laboratories where I spent my days, things didn't add up. For one, the official explanation for the illness kept changing. On Monday, the media confidently reported it was a new strain of SARS, highly contagious and airborne. By Wednesday, they retracted that, claiming it was an Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever. Then came theories about a mutated rabies virus, even an exotic fungus. It was chaos, with each day bringing a new contradictory narrative. I had never seen the CDC so scattered, or was someone else calling the shots? My colleagues and I got daily briefings from those nameless operatives, but their updates were just as confusing. When I pressed them for the virus's genome sequence or even its official name, I got either silence or thin, evasive answers. Late one night, I received a secure email on my personal laptop. It was from an old friend of mine, Daniel, a data analyst who had contacts in the intelligence community. His message was brief and alarming. "Evelyn, something is off. Check patient 0 data. Stay safe." Heart pounding, I logged into the National Epidemiological Database, a system I had clearance for. When I pulled up the records for the supposed patient 0 of the outbreak, my blood ran cold. According to the records, the first documented case was a 43-year-old schoolteacher in our city, admitted on March 3rd. But I knew for a fact we didn't see our first case until March 10th. I had personally reviewed all early cases. Where did this March 3rd case come from? The more I dug, the stranger it got. The patient 0 record had no doctor's notes, no contact tracing, just an entry that he died on March 5th. I decided to call Daniel, but the call wouldn't connect, just a staticky nothing as if the lines were cut. That was the first time I felt truly afraid for myself. Daniel had always been level-headed, not one for conspiracies. If he was spooked enough to warn me, I knew I had stepped onto dangerous ground. I shut my laptop and stared at the dark reflection of myself on the screen. What is happening? I thought. In that moment of silence, I realized something chilling. In a world drowning in noise, news reports, emergency alerts, panicked chatter, certain crucial facts had gone eerily silent. The next morning, a grim rumor swept through the hospital grapevine. Daniel was dead. Officially, he had succumbed to the virus overnight. They said he collapsed in his apartment, that he must have caught it from a data courier or a contaminated document. But I knew Daniel worked from home, religiously wore a mask outside, and wasn't even in close contact with patients. The news didn't sit right with me. A heavy chill settled in my gut. Daniel had tried to warn me, and now he was gone. By now, the city was in full lockdown, but I had clearance as a doctor to travel for essential duties. Under the guise of a supply run, I drove to Daniel's apartment across town, deserted streets stretching out like an empty maze. The sky was iron gray, and the only sound was the occasional wail of distant sirens. When I reached his building, I found the front door propped open, as if someone left in a hurry. I climbed the stairs, heart thudding, and found his apartment unlocked. Inside, it was a wreck. Drawers pulled out, papers and clothes strewn everywhere. It looked like someone had turned the place upside down, searching for something. I picked my way through the chaos until I found his laptop, or rather what was left of it. It had been smashed violently, the screen in shards. Whoever did this wanted to make sure no one could retrieve what was on it. My eyes burned with tears as I realized this wasn't just an illness taking friends from me. This was something else, someone else, covering their tracks. In the corner of the living room, I noticed Daniel's bookshelf had also been ransacked. Books lay scattered on the floor. Daniel loved old spy novels and conspiracy thrillers. It painfully crossed my mind that he was now caught in one. As I stood in the mess, I remembered how we used to tease each other with secret codes back in our college days. Daniel had a quirky habit. He often hid important things in plain sight. I scanned the room and my eyes landed on a particular book, one of his favorites, 1984 by George Orwell. It was lying open face down. I picked it up and a small scrap of paper fluttered out. On it, hurriedly scribbled, were two words that made my blood run cold: Project Decibel. Beneath it, a flash drive was taped to the page. My hands trembled. This was what Daniel must have wanted me to find. Before I could think, I pocketed the flash drive and the note. Just then, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. My pulse spiked. I realized I had left the apartment door ajar. Someone was out there. For a second, I stood paralyzed, imagining one of those faceless operatives in a hazmat suit or a dark-suited agent waiting to pounce. Gathering my courage, I peered out. The hallway was empty, but I swore I saw a shadow just turning the corner at the far end. I wasn't alone here. I forced myself to walk calmly out of the building, but inside I was shaking. I could feel unseen eyes on me. I got back in my car and drove off, trying not to speed, trying not to be obvious. In the rearview mirror, a black SUV appeared, keeping a steady distance behind me. My mouth went dry. It tailed me through 3 turns. On the 4th turn, I yanked the wheel suddenly and veered into a narrow side street, then into an alley, killing the engine and lights. I held my breath as the SUV's engine rumbled past the alley mouth and faded. Whether it was paranoia or not, I knew one thing for sure. I was being followed. Back in the safety of my small apartment, with all lights off and curtains drawn, I plugged the flash drive into an old laptop that I disconnected from Wi-Fi. My hands were still shaking as I opened the only folder on it, labeled Decibel Dossiers. Inside were several files, documents, images, and a video. I clicked on a file named executive-summary.pdf and began to read. It was like peering into the devil's playbook. The document was an internal memo, stamped with bold red letters, "Top Secret, Eyes Only." As I scrolled, my eyes caught phrases that made my heart pound. Mass psychological operation, strategic social disruption, controlled narrative. The memo described something called Project Decibel, a joint endeavor between several government agencies and private contractors. It detailed a plan to manipulate public opinion on a massive scale. My breath hitched as I read the next lines. Objective: simulate a national crisis, codenamed Operation Siren. Driving the populace into a state of fear, then introduce calibrated propaganda to shape beliefs and behaviors. End goal: fracture social cohesion and enable a controlled reorganization of power structures. I felt sick. They were talking about deliberately breaking society, turning citizen against citizen, and they had done it under the perfect guise: a viral outbreak. The memo went on to outline phases of the operation. In Phase 1, they planned to release coordinated reports of a deadly new pathogen, not actually releasing a real virus, but releasing fear. They used a few covert operatives posing as medical experts to seed the story in different hospitals. That explained the mysterious Patient Zero entry and those operatives at our hospital. In Phase 2, they leveraged social media and news outlets to amplify panic. They even had code names for the techniques. Operation Mockingbird was referenced, an old Cold War CIA project to influence media, resurrected for the modern age. They had journalists and editors on their payroll, churning out frightening headlines on cue. Phase 3 was where things turned even darker. The file described targeted psychographic propaganda. I recognized that term. Psychographics was the method used by companies like Cambridge Analytica to profile and influence voters by their personality traits and online behavior. But this was psychographics weaponized by the government on its own people. The documents bragged about data harvested from social media, smartphones, even those home assistant devices listening in our living rooms. They tailored fear-mongering content to different demographics. For some, they pushed messages that the virus was a hoax, that the real threat was government tyranny. These people were groomed to become angry, defiant, ready to rebel. For others, they pushed the opposite extreme, that anyone questioning the virus was a dangerous lunatic putting the community at risk. These people were driven to hate and ostracize the first group. It was a divide and conquer strategy on a scale never seen before. My eyes welled with tears as it all clicked together. The endless online arguments, the street protests that had erupted and quickly turned violent, neighbors turning on neighbors. It was engineered. We hadn't stood a chance. We were lab rats in a nationwide experiment. And the deaths? There were real deaths. The memo was clinical. Projected mortality impact, 10 to 15% of population, proportionate mortality, sufficient to instill pervasive trauma, acceptable collateral for strategic objective. They coldly calculated how many needed to die for the operation to succeed. Many deaths were likely induced quietly, through stress, withheld care, or targeted accidents, then blamed on the phantom virus. I recalled that poor man in the ICU screaming about the noise. A shiver ran down my spine. In another file, I found a hint of an explanation. There was mention of a sonic component, devices that could emit high-frequency sounds to cause disorientation, even hemorrhages. Project Decibel, I realized, wasn't just a metaphor about volume or loud information. They literally used sound as a weapon, like some twisted orchestra conducting fear. They had even learned from past dark chapters. In one section, the dossier referenced COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert program in the 20th century that targeted and discredited civil rights and anti-war leaders, noting how planting false narratives could splinter communities. In another breath, it cited MK Ultra, the notorious CIA mind control experiments, as a primitive precursor to what was now possible. I sat there reading in disbelief. Our government had turned those playbooks against us on a scale that made those old operations look like child's play. I clicked on the video file next, labeled decibeltestimonies.mp4. It was a compilation of hidden camera footage and interviews with key Project Decibel personnel, likely recorded by Daniel's contacts as evidence. Grainy clips showed lab coat-clad scientists discussing delivery of ultrasonic emitters, military officials in meeting rooms talking about controlling the narrative, and tech executives bragging about algorithms that could make any truth deafening and any truth teller silent. In one clip, a nervous-looking woman, her ID badge just out of view, said, "The public thinks it's a virus. That's what we sold them. Fear is the contagion. Fear is the virus." My heart pounded at her words. Another voice, gruff and matter-of-fact, added, "This country needed a reset. People will panic, yes. People will fight each other, yes. But from the ashes, we'll rebuild order. Sometimes you have to break something to fix it." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This was not just about power. Some of them truly believed this was for the greater good. A violent, diluted utopia. By the time I finished reviewing the flash drive, dawn light was creeping through my curtained windows. I had spent the whole night absorbing the truth of Project Decibel. I closed the laptop, feeling a mix of horror, anger, and deep sorrow. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. It was real, and it was happening. The civil unrest, the neighborhoods reduced to embers during riots, the militias forming in the countryside, the mass graves we dug for pandemic victims, all of it had been orchestrated. I realized with a sinking feeling that if this drive fell into the wrong hands, it would vanish like Daniel did. I was now the sole guardian of this terrifying secret, and I felt its weight on my shoulders. What on earth was I supposed to do with it? In the weeks after discovering the truth, I lived like a fugitive ghost. Civil war had effectively erupted in the country's streets. Not that anyone wanted to call it that yet. But when armed militias and makeshift citizen armies are exchanging gunfire with National Guard units in multiple states, what else do you call it? The chaos that Project Decibel's masters unleashed was beyond even their control now. Cities were war zones, downtown districts became no man's lands at night, and rural counties declared themselves autonomous from a government they no longer trusted. I moved from motel to motel, dodging both the violence outside and the assassins I knew were likely hunting me. Every day on the radio, one of the few devices I trusted to receive news, I heard the competing narratives still blaring. One station shrieked about traitors spreading disease and lies, while another insisted the government itself was the enemy. The country was tearing itself apart, just as the documents had foretold. I couldn't keep this secret to myself, but I also knew walking into a TV station or a newspaper office with it was a death sentence. So I tried more covert ways. I mailed copies of the flash drive to 3 investigative journalists I'd quietly admired for their integrity. I sent out encrypted emails from internet cafes to international human rights organizations, attaching snippets of the evidence. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. If enough people saw this, maybe the tide could be turned, the fighting could stop. But days passed, and nothing. No big exposés on the news, no contact from the journalists. Silence. It was as if my messages vanished into the void. One night, I got my answer in the form of a single anonymous text on the burner phone I used. "We know what you did. Nowhere is safe." A cold dread washed over me. They were intercepting my communications, pruning away my attempts to expose them like one would pluck weeds. Of the 3 journalists, one was reported missing the next day, and the other 2 publicly discredited a week later over unrelated scandals that suddenly came to light. It was clear Project Decibel had tendrils everywhere, and they were not above ruining or erasing anyone who threatened their cover. Exhausted and desperate, I found myself spiraling into hopelessness. The violence around us was escalating, and I had failed to stop it. I was haunted by nightmares of the faces of those patients in the hospital, of Daniel's lifeless apartment, of that poor man begging for silence as he died. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard echoes of his scream. "It's so loud." Sometimes, I feared it was all in my head, that maybe the stress had broken me and concocted an elaborate conspiracy as a coping mechanism. But then, I would touch the flash drive around my neck. I wore Daniel's evidence on a cord under my shirt, and I remembered every word I'd read. The nightmare was real, and I was living in it. In this turmoil, I also found unexpected allies, a small underground network of doctors, journalists, and even a couple of disillusioned soldiers had begun trading information quietly, suspecting a hidden hand behind the madness. They reached out to me after one of the journalists I'd tried to contact shared my tip with someone they trusted before he vanished. Through encrypted chats and whispered midnight meetings in abandoned buildings, I started sharing what I knew with these few brave souls. We formed a fragile plan to get my first-hand testimony and the Project Decibel files to the public in a way that couldn't be silenced, a mass release, mirrored across the internet by sympathizers. It was a long shot, but it was all we had. Which brings me to now. This moment, speaking to you through whatever screen you're on. This video, this testimony, is part of that plan I mentioned. As you watch this, know that I have already spread every file, every shred of evidence I have, across multiple secure channels. Truth has a way of seeping out, like water through cracks, and I'm counting on that. Project Decibel thrived on secrecy and silence, and I aim to break that silence with this single, unified roar. I understand that hearing this, you might be recoiling in disbelief. A government plot to fake a pandemic and incite a civil war? It sounds absurd, I know. Just a few years ago, I would have dismissed it as the ravings of a madwoman. Even with everything I've lived through, part of me still struggles to accept that people we trusted as leaders could orchestrate something so monstrous. You have every right to be skeptical. In fact, I want you to be skeptical. Question everything, including my story. But don't dismiss it. Look around at the world right now. The endless rage online, the funerals, the shattered families, the way every discussion turns into a bitter feud. Does it truly feel like a natural occurrence to you? Or does it feel, perhaps, manufactured? I wish I could prove beyond any doubt that what I'm saying is true. I've included as much evidence as I safely can with this broadcast, but I suspect the architects of Project Decibel are already working to muddy the waters. By tomorrow, they'll call me a liar, a fraud, maybe say I'm a disgruntled doctor who lost her mind in the pandemic. They'll wheel out their experts to assure you this is all a hoax. They might even produce fake evidence to discredit me. Frankly, I don't know what will happen next. Maybe this sparks an awakening and people demand answers. Maybe nothing changes at all. The thought of that is almost too much to bear. As for me, I don't know if I'll be around after this goes live. I've accepted that. I see my reflection in the camera lens now, and I barely recognize myself. I'm just so tired. I've been running and hiding for so long, and I'm tired of being scared. Whatever happens to me, I need you to hear what I've said and decide for yourself what to believe. If enough of us choose to see through the lies, Project Decibel loses its power. 2 years ago, I was a doctor who believed my purpose was to save lives from a virus. Today, I know my purpose is to save truth from being smothered by a lie. If I'm gone after this, please remember my story. Remember Daniel, who died trying to bring this to light. Remember the innocents who lost their lives in the so-called outbreak and the conflict that followed. They deserve justice. They deserve to have the truth known, no matter how dark it is. I started this recording by saying I'm either in hiding or dead. The truth is, after this, I'll be both in a way. I'll have to disappear completely. And if they find me, well, you know what that means. Either way, this is likely the last time you'll hear my voice. My name is Dr. Evelyn Barnes. I was a whistleblower inside Project Decibel, and I've told you everything I know. The rest is up to you now. Stay safe, stay alert, and please, listen for the truth behind the noise. Because if you don't, if we all don't, the next time, we might not get another warning.
And that was the final known transmission of Dr. Evelyn Barnes, vanished without a trace just 72 hours after this recording went live. The files she leaked have since been discredited, erased, or quietly buried. Yet whispers of Project Decibel still echo across the darkest corners of the internet. So the next time the world feels like it's tearing itself apart, ask yourself, is it chaos or is it choreography? Project Decibel didn't spread a virus. It spread a volume too loud to ignore and too dangerous to believe.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.